So why should we be concerned about integrity in research? Thank you. So many concepts captured in those few words. First of all, there's the issues around what is misconduct, and there are examples here which you could probably readily recognise as being reasonable examples of what research integrity is all about, or research misconduct is about. But the interesting thing is here that when there is a case of research misconduct, it damages the scientific enterprise, is a misuse of public funds quite often, not always, but can be a misuse of public funds. But what I mean to say there is that if the research has been funded by a government, then it is definitely, if there's been research misconduct, then it has been a misuse of public funds. And as a result of that, there are very significant legal consequences to you as an individual or you and your institution, because a misuse of public money is a very, very serious issue. But perhaps more importantly is this issue of undermining the trust of citizens in science and in government. Now, what that is all about is that citizens pay their taxes to the government, and the government uses that tax income to support research. So if research is false and it's been a waste of the taxpayers' money, then the citizens will get upset. And the only people they can really get upset against is the government. So that's why it's so important that governments and countries and institutions have policies and procedures that will deal with misconduct in research, but more importantly, establish policies and procedures that minimise the risk that that will happen. Because once it's happened, it's very damaging to the individual and the institution and the government. I think, next slide please, Loris. Now, from the same publication from the OECD, this is a publication which talks about best practices for ensuring scientific integrity and preventing misconduct, and you can see the sorts of topics that are in that. The only reason I put this slide in is to reinforce to you that many countries across the world have an interest in research integrity. And this is a publication from the OECD which represents, I think, 34 different countries. So they've all joined together in terms of producing this sort of paper. Next slide, please, Loris. Another example is in the United States. In particular, I wanted to put this in because just a few years ago in the United States, the White House, the Office of Science and Technology Policy was established. And what that office required was that every institution had to submit to that office for approval and for review their policies and procedures on dealing with research integrity. So the government of the United States is very interested in making sure that all research that is conducted appropriately in that country. So all the institutions had to respond to this. Next slide, Lawrence. In Australia, we have a similar situation, and most recently we've established this Australian Research Integrity Committee. And this is a small committee which is designed to assist institutions in dealing with cases where there has been suspicion of research misconduct. So we have policies and procedures, and this is just one arm of that. Next slide, Loris. Just to show you some other examples from my country where I'm familiar with the system there. In this situation, we have on the top left the Australian Code of Practice for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes. So quite rigorous controls over the use of animals. And this is backed up by this sort of document here, the Animal Welfare Act in each state in Australia. Each state has an act which is an Animal Welfare Act, and if you mistreat animals in research, you are subject to the legal penalties which occur in the Act of Parliament about misuse of animals. The document on the right is the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, which is a document constructed in collaboration between a number of government agencies. And then finally, the big document in the middle of that slide, the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research. And that code refers out to the ethical conduct in human research as well as all the animal research issues. So we have quite a set of documents that are surrounding this area which researchers need to be familiar with. Okay, so just taking an example from our code of conduct in research, which is not dissimilar to many codes from many different countries. And because I had access to the document, I just produced some of the documentation here for you to see. So, responsible research is encouraged and guided by the research culture of the organisation. A strong research culture will demonstrate. Now, what this means is that there are responsibilities throughout an institution. And as you'll see in a moment, there are responsibilities of the institution's leadership, as well as the responsibilities of individual researchers within that institution. But the culture which is established in an institution is so important for being able to demonstrate publicly and giving the citizens of the country confidence that an institution is aware of its responsibilities. It will demonstrate honesty and integrity, respect for human research participants, animals and the environment, good stewardship of public resources used to conduct research, and that's quite a complex issue, appropriate acknowledgement of the role of others in research, and responsible communication of research results. So these are the fundamental issues around research integrity. It's not just plagiarism. There's a whole range of things which go to underpin proper research conduct, as we'll see in a moment. Next slide, Loris. So here we go to the responsibilities of institutions, and I've just given you one example here from our code, and that is institutions are expected to promote awareness of all guidelines and legislation to the staff, provide documents setting out clearly the policies and procedures, actively encourage mutual cooperation, etc., and maintain a climate in which responsible and ethical behaviour in research is expected. So this is from a public document. So a citizen in a country could ask a question of a vice-chancellor of a university, what are you doing to maintain a climate in which responsible and ethical behaviour in research is expected? So if you don't have any policies and procedures, you're already in a difficult position, because this is a public expectation of the institution. I'll come back to some of those points a little later. Next slide, Loris. Responsibilities of researchers. So, a responsibility of all researchers is to maintain high standards in their research, and so you can read the dot points there. You can see the breadth of responsibility of a researcher to be able to meet the requirements of the Code of Conduct for responsible conduct of research.
I think what I like from this document is that it clearly outlines what the responsibilities of the researcher and responsibility for the institutions.
Yeah.
So it's a good dialogue between the
exactly
the two.
Right.
Yeah.
And as we'll see in a moment, there are some other. What's going on? Is it me or there's? Oh, it's somewhere else. Okay. Yes, that's right. And in other sections of the document, which I've stripped down for sake of clarity in this presentation, there are these dual responsibilities, the responsibility of the institution as well as the responsibility of the individual. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some of the areas that as I say, I've stripped out a lot of the information just to make sure that we get through this as quickly as possible. I just wanted to touch on about 6 or 7 areas that are in the Code of Conduct for research. The first one is management of research data and primary materials. What does this require? It requires individual researchers to record and store their data appropriately. What's the responsibility on the institution? The institution has to require their researchers to do that, but it also should provide the systems whereby they can do it. Why is it important? It's very important because when a case of suspected misconduct arises, the way in which you try and deal with that situation is to go back to the original data. If the original data are missing, then you have a real problem. And it gets very messy from that point on. So, responsible conduct means recording and managing data. Supervision of research trainees. There's a whole range of responsibilities of the institution and the individual researcher to look after the research trainees and to bring them through responsibly with their own attitudes being developed towards integrity in research. So again, a very important area because sometimes things arise when a research trainee doesn't perform the research appropriately or does the wrong thing in research, and that could lead to falsification of data, but it might be unintentional. But if there is falsified data, then suspicions of research misconduct arise, but if it was unintentional, then it's not necessarily research misconduct. So being able to train research people in the appropriate conduct of research is very important for that reason. Next slide. Publication and dissemination of research findings. There are ethical dimensions to this, such that it's imperative that you publish and disseminate research findings because it's been supported by public money. You should disseminate your findings and you should disseminate them accurately without falsification, etc. That's one thing, but another thing is that if you have a result which is unexpected and is what we might term a negative result, in other words, you did some study which turned out to not show what you were expecting it to show, you have a responsibility to publish that or disseminate that information. So and this comes to the issue of clinical trials. Clinical trials sponsored by a pharmaceutical company which don't show an outcome need to be published. Otherwise, people will repeat that study and waste money, which is unethical, and it will involve patients, and that is unethical. So there's a whole range of issues around this issue of dissemination of research findings. Authorship, another area of contention quite often, is you must include everyone who is relevant to the publication that has been put out. But there are two extremes to that. One is including people who have had no responsible action in doing that research. And this comes to a very difficult situation. I see some smiles around the table already, where a senior professor demands to have their name on a paper that their research student has published, simply because the work was done somewhere in that department. That's unethical behaviour. And not including people that are legitimately contributing to that research outcome is also unethical behaviour. So authorship is a contentious issue. Peer review is an interesting one. Peer review, we all have a responsibility to be involved in peer review, particularly of international research. And the issue here is that if you are in a situation of undertaking peer review, you have an ethical responsibility and integrity responsibility not to divulge that information and not to take the idea that you've read about as a peer reviewer and say, oh, I might use that information to get a grant to write another paper myself. Thank you very much. Okay, that's unethical behaviour, and it happens. Because the world is so competitive these days in winning research funds, the theft of ideas from a grant application or a pre-publication into somebody else's work is a really contentious issue and difficult one. So you have to be aware of that under the issues of peer review. Conflicts of interest, particularly in commercially supported research. It's very important that when you publish the results of a commercially funded project that you declare that it was commercially funded and by whom. Otherwise, the results that you get will be interpreted one way, which may be inaccurate, because people don't necessarily trust the results that have been reported without the declaration of conflict of interest. And collaboration across research institutions. This is an important area because different institutions might have different policies and procedures with respect to capturing intellectual property, for example. So giving credit where it is due when the work has been done with different institutions is most important. So if there are 6 researchers, 3 in one institution in Indonesia and 3 researchers in Japan, it's very important that the 6 researchers from both countries are included in the details of the publication. So they're just a few examples, but the major headings that I've put up here are the major headings from our Code of Responsible Conduct of Research, and you'll find similar headings in all sorts of policies from around the world. Laris, next slide. I just wanted to show you a few slides taken from the website of the University of Queensland. The reason why I've put these slides in is just to show you what that university has done in recent times. I was invited some years ago to review their policies and procedures on research integrity because they had some serious issues that arose and they wanted to understand why did those issues arise. So I reviewed all their policies and procedures. So I became very familiar with this university. This is their homepage for research, and this red box now covers over a section of the UQ research and innovation part of their website, which deals with integrity and compliance. One more click, Laris. Okay, so on that slide we have certain areas which go to research integrity, which you can see here. So this is all public information. You could find this on your smartphone if you happen to be distracted from my presentation this morning. So up here we have a section on research integrity. Next click. And that is the text which appears when you click on that section of the website. So there's a whole range here. This is research integrity. This is the name and address and the phone number of the research integrity advisor at the university. And here is a listing of further links in the website which take you to their policies and procedures. One more click. Here is an example. This is some information which is freely available on the website in one of the policies. And it's the case of, well, how do we deal with a matter when it arises? So there's the example text there of what the university will actually do. And it talks about what is research misconduct. So that's freely, publicly available to everyone in the world to read what the University of Queensland is actually doing. Every other university in Australia will do a similar thing. And I'm sure it happens in other international institutions as well. Next slide. One more click. Adi.
In terms of absolute number, it may look as it is still small, but for sure the trend is going up. Now, this means, well, it could mean both good and bad. The good part of it is as we become more aware of the research misconduct, they will try to seek deeper on the problem, and they know how to identify the research misconduct. So naturally, it goes up. But then after that, it shouldn't. At some stage, it shouldn't continue to go up because we need to also prevent research misconduct. So I'm just highlighting you. I think this is very interesting on who commits research misconduct. And the biggest proportion is... Okay, but be patient. After this, you're going to like the slide after this. So the biggest proportion is postdoctoral fellow. But there you would see that also even assistant professor or scientists, they also commit research misconduct. Yeah, so senior PI, graduate student, and others. So, I mean, this highlights again that it doesn't mean that when you have your PhD, yeah, you have the license to do the research that you want to do, that doesn't mean that we are not prone to research misconduct. So we still have to be aware of and make sure that we do everything to prevent this from happening. The next slide. Yeah, I mean, again, this is just showing among the plagiarism, fabrication, falsification, how which type is most oftenly reported. And the data for this is a bit from 2008, so many years ago. But I think so far in the university, whenever we discuss, in the faculty, sorry, whenever we discuss about research misconduct, I think the #1 topic that we talk about is plagiarism. Because maybe in a way this is rather easier to talk and easier. Well, actually the more serious problem is falsification and fabrication. So that's the 2/3 of the problem. And this is also interesting. Majority is reported by someone else. So it's not the researcher, and someone else, whatever motive is that. Yeah? Okay, next I think you're going to like this one and see who commits research misconduct. Yeah, so 22% in this is suspected to be done by a professor or social science. So again, it highlights that this is everyone's problem. It's not about seniority or junior, or it's not about that, but it happens to all. Yeah, so why does it occur? Why does this occur? So this is, I think probably you can find yourself one of the factors that may influence why research misconduct happen, from poor supervision, too much work, too much Facebook and browsing internet while doing research, smoking in the lab, lack of time, lack of training, lack of interest. Yeah, that's very dangerous. Incentives, fame, fortune, proof of health theory, and cut corners. So, I mean, these are the factors that could contribute to research misconduct. Now, however, this morning, so my productive time happens to be between 4 to 6, I think you know already. So that's when I send emails and read. So this morning I found a very interesting publication, which I like to read the sentence for you. But actually, there is more important factors rather than this. And according to this paper, yeah, the result says that scientific misconduct is more likely in countries that lack research integrity policies. Countries where individual publication performance is rewarded with cash. I'm not saying anything. In cultures and situations where mutual criticism is hampered, and in the earlier phases of a researcher's career. So actually what this paper suggests is that might be most effective to focus on promoting research integrity policies, improving mentoring, and I'm looking at you, mentoring and training, and encouraging transparent communication among researchers. So,
in an accusation of research misconduct. So the first step is it needs to be a written complaint that research misconduct may have occurred. Sometimes somebody will go along and just whisper to somebody, I think there's a problem here. Well, first step is that if it's perceived to be a potentially serious issue, then somebody needs to document the issue. It needs to be written. Then there needs to be a preliminary inquiry, and in the systems that we operate in my country, we have what is called a designated person. An institution needs to identify somebody who can be a designated person to whom a complaint can be directed. And that person or delegate needs to initiate a discrete preliminary inquiry. Now, the reason for this is that the original complaint, which may have been lodged, may be a false complaint. So you don't want to make something public which is false. And because you need to protect the reputation of the person against whom the complaint has been made. So there needs to be a preliminary investigation done, which is done very quietly, confidentially, to see whether there is any substance to the complaint at all. So this gets to this point here. Is there any substance to the complaint? If there is no substance, then that's the end of the matter. Clearly there needs to be feedback to the person who made the complaint to tell them that there is no substance to the issue, and one hopes that that deals with the matter. It may not necessarily. The other outcome here, possible, there are minor issues. In other words, it may have been an inadvertent mistake. It may not have been a serious or what we call a reckless action, and therefore it can be remedied using counselling and improvement of behaviour and so on and so forth. If there is substance to the complaint, then it usually goes on to a further investigation. And in this situation here, the preliminary investigation starts off with the accusation being made to the person against whom the complaint has been raised. So the person who may be responsible for the research misconduct is told what is the accusation against them, and part of the preliminary investigation is to have people look at that issue and seek advice from the person who, or seek an input from the person who has been accused against. The dashed line here simply represents that sometimes a receipt of a formal complaint might be so obvious that it looks like very serious research misconduct, you can jump straight down to the preliminary investigation. Next slide. So you do the preliminary investigation, and that investigation really comes up with the answer, is there what we call a prima facie case of research misconduct? That is, there's sufficient evidence to show you on the basis of the evidence that research misconduct has occurred. In this case, if that investigation reveals that there's no such case to be made, that's the end of the matter. Or again, we might have some minor issues that are identified out of that which can be remedied. In other words, it's not in a case of really, really serious misconduct. If, however, it is shown that there is a primary case, then there's an inquiry panel established, and the report of that finding then goes to the Chief Executive Officer of the university or the institution. The result is, if research misconduct is found as a result of that inquiry, then certain things will happen. If it's not, then corrections are made here, and the reputation of the person against whom the accusations have been made needs to be restored. So if you get through all of this, you've got a very difficult job here, because there's now public information available about the accusation, and restoring somebody's reputation as a result down at this point in the process is really quite difficult. So that's why all of these careful steps are taken before you get to this point. If there is research misconduct found, then the chief executive or their delegate refers it off to initiate other procedures which might lead to demotion.
In your role as a Vice-Chancellor, did you have practical experience of this process?
Yes. Not necessarily in the role as a Vice-Chancellor, but at other times in my career, yes. I could put those in vague terms, but we've got some case studies coming up which have not necessarily been my own personal experience, but have been experience of others that I have been exposed to, and I'm happy to talk through those issues, just to give you examples of what can seriously go wrong. Move them on, which is a severe career interruption for them, I can assure you. Yep.
I have another question, and that is in times where we work more transnationally and we see more of international collaboration across institutions. But would you consider that it's a higher risk in general?
Yes, there's a significantly higher risk when cultural differences come into play. Particularly in the issue that I explained. Well, one example issue is the issue of senior professors demanding to be placed on a paper in a particular authorship order. It can be quite torturous in terms of investigating it, as well as determining an appropriate outcome. So yes, cultural differences are important. Another area of cultural difference, which may or may not be true, but I think it's there, and that is there are different cultural issues with respect to how human subjects are used in research. The ethical approval processes, etc., are not necessarily uniform, even between institutions, let alone across country borders. So that's another difficult area. But in general, I think the practices of research these days are not unreasonably common. What I'm trying to say is that there is a familiarity with the issues that we're dealing with here in this presentation across national borders now. It's improved a lot. But as Adi pointed out, there is still a significant number of cases arising in all sorts of countries where bad behaviour actually becomes apparent.
I will just give you an example from the master course that we had. We had a few South Africans with Indian origin in our course, and the reason why I say that is that they have a lot of Indians that they teach in their institution. And they outsource, so they don't do plagiarism, but they outsource the work of the thesis to Indians in India. Go through the regular process of just checking plagiarism, because that's not the case. It's just
So that is where policies in an institution come into play, and people have to declare on a legal document that the work is theirs only. And if they falsify that and it's found out, then their degree can be rescinded. It's very serious issues.
I already published, and there's an audit, but about how I did my research, how I did analysis and everything to check the quality, but also if in any case they found there's a misconduct, how do you see?
Well, that will be discovered from the audit. As a result of the audit on this scheme, on the previous slide, there would be a preliminary discrete investigation undertaken. Okay? So that you weren't embarrassed, necessarily, until the facts of the matter were actually checked. And that's where data management and data records become so important. Because, well, I'll explain more in one of the case examples about how data management was actually important in reaching a conclusion on a particular matter. She has a very responsible position, and the course enables participants too. Now, the reason for putting that up is that this is part of the institution's responsibility under the Code for Good Research Conduct. This is publicly available information, and staff should be aware of it as well, and they've got a whole range of, as I can attest to, they have a whole range of other significant policies related to this area. Next slide. Okay, case one.
Yeah. So what we are going to do next is that we develop 4 cases, and we want each group to work on one case only, and the case differs between one case and another. So the first one, just to highlight the problem. Yeah. So this is a senior PhD student, almost defending her dissertation. And after the seminar, so they have to do this here in the system here, they have to do the seminar first, and then they can go to the further step, which is the ujian tertutup, the closed defense. So accidentally, just before her closed defense, this senior PhD found that a junior PhD student enrolled in the same university, and even in fact this junior PhD student often consulted to her because they have the same big team. But Anna then found out that actually in her proposal that Amy defended already, the proposal, she found a lot of the writing is actually taken from Anna's work. So, and then Anna showed her supervisor, this is the part of the work that is plagiarized. And the fact is that Amy already passed the proposal defense and was in the process of data collection. So this is one case. I'll just go through another case. PhD student in one department is compulsory to have one international publication before the open defense. Now, although this is not the faculty requirement, but it's the department requirement. So whoever is doing PhD in that department. So then another senior lecturer actually reported to me that a student sent her manuscript to a journal, which happens to be Jurnal Apal-Apal, Predator Journal. And manuscript was accepted, and she paid herself 27 million. That's not a small money. It's a big money. And apparently, it wasn't a real journal. So now she has passed the defense and was already given a PhD degree. So that's the second case. And then for the next two cases, Ellen, please.
Yeah. This is a case that is roughly real. I've tried to hide the real intent and the real people involved in this. But this is a situation where research was done which involved commercial support for the project. And there was some questions about some of the data that was used in the paper. And the question arose as to whether the data was accurate in the patent and whether the data were accurate in the situation of applying for the money from the commercial partner. So you can read this one. Sometime after a paper was published in a prestigious international journal by a very senior professor and a junior colleague, another member of staff remarked that they saw no evidence that the human subjects reported in the paper ever attended the research laboratory. So we'll discuss that one.
Okay. Yeah. So this
we
is
want you to think about what would you do if you were the person who received the information from another member of staff that they thought there was something funny going on. What would you do?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for that they should go and discuss in the group discussion. So in the group discussion, I think it's
so
correct. How would you
You could
react?
probably pick your case. Which one do you want to do?
So the next slide. What would you do? That's I think, and then, reflect a little bit on what problem is this and why it happens. But don't spend time on this. It's more of what would you do and what we need to have to minimize this to happen. And any suggestions on the structures and mechanisms, and this is within the faculty, that you think would be needed to deal with the case. Finally, then we have a final discussion. Yeah. So please go to the table, case 1, 2, 3, 4.